Good evening, everyone. Is this on, yeah? Yep, fantastic. In order to combat nerves, I've decided to approach this talk as if I was talking to a middle school class. So with that in mind, phones away, everyone. Laptops closed, eyes and ears in this direction. Thank you. Sit up, Harper, for goodness sake. No, do you know what? I'm leaving anyway. Just this once, you can sit however you want. If you have been given a piece of paper and a pen, I would like you to follow along with this, please. We're going to do one of my all-time favorite critical thinking exercises. If you haven't been given a piece of paper and a pen, and the lights are so bright that I honestly have no idea who has been given one and who hasn't, please follow along by visualizing this on a blank piece of paper in your mind. As I say, one of my all-time favorite critical thinking exercises. Welcome to Pac Dave's Criticality Club. Task number 1, draw a map of the world. Do this individually. Do your best, but don't worry if it's not very good. That's kind of the point. There are no more instructions. Good luck. Forgive me if I can't devote the usual amount of time that I would devote to this. Usually I would give a class 5 minutes to carry this out. Obviously, we don't have time for that, so please do carry on as I'm speaking. If you don't have a piece of paper in front of you, I'd like you to think carefully about what that world map would look like to you. Imagine that pencil going towards the blank piece of paper, where it will be drawn to, where the point of your pencil begins drawing, the continents, the islands that we're familiar with, the ones that we're not so familiar with. We've all seen this image hundreds, maybe thousands of times before, so it should be easy, right? Maybe not. Lesson number 1, there is a huge difference between knowing something and being able to apply that knowledge. It's worth remembering, as teachers and as parents, that the words, I don't know, may very often mean, I know, I just don't know how to get it out of my mind and onto the piece of paper in front of me. Our second lesson of the day is that knowledge is relative. It's flexible. It changes depending on who you are, the person that is gaining or applying that knowledge. Any Indonesian, and I'm sure many of us in this room, is able to sketch out with reasonable confidence that amazing K-shape of the island of Sulawesi, the long equatorial sweep of Sumatra and Java and Bali, maybe a big blob somewhere for Borneo. But I'm guessing that most of us would struggle much more to sketch out a rough estimation of, say, the Caribbean islands or the Philippine archipelago. I'm guessing that even if you've drawn the vast continent of Africa, many of us have forgotten about the island of Madagascar, the world's 4th largest island that hugs the east coast of that continent. Was that right?
Yeah, I just drew it.
Oh, you just drew it. Well done. Fantastic, Harper. I taught her for 2 years, so she knows what's up. Yeah. And it's fine if we struggle to draw these islands. I could no more ask you to remember the shape of the Caribbean islands or Madagascar or the Philippine archipelago than we could expect somebody in Kingston or Manila or Antananarivo, which is the capital of Madagascar, I found out recently, to know the shape of Sulawesi. Our knowledge, like our maps of the world, is rooted in ourselves, in our experiences, the views of our families, our friends, our teachers, the lenses through which we see the world. Let's check your work. We can probably all agree that this is a map of the world, right? There's probably a few Kiwis in the audience rolling their eyes thinking, yeah, it's happened again. There's practically a cottage industry of world maps which leave off New Zealand. It's almost like we're doing it on purpose, and I have no idea why. That's not the end of the story by any means, though. Our maps of the world, and I'm sure yours as well, regularly miss out an entire continent, 9% of the world's landmass, more landmass than either Europe, without Russia, or Australia. When Antarctica is included, it's generally relegated to a jagged line at the bottom of our maps. Let's think, if our map of the world is missing 9% of the world, what else are we missing? Lesson number 3, knowledge is imperfect. Just like our maps of the world, it has gaps that we might not even be aware of. But just like our maps, the way that we think, the way that we gain and apply knowledge can be shifted, can benefit from new perspectives. And in doing so, just like with this map behind me, We can learn to ask critical questions of our worldview. Questions like, wait, is Europe maybe not in the center of the world? What then does it mean to be from the West, or the Middle East, or the Far East? Could it even be that those terms were just made up by people to try and make sense of the world, and that the terms themselves might reflect some of the prejudices and biases of the people who invented them? And I'm guessing that few of us, perhaps none of us, drew a world map that looks like this. Why would we? It's upside down, right? Yes. And no. If we could zoom right out into outer space, we could see the world from countless new perspectives and ways of seeing it. Because the construct of the North Pole being up is just that, a construct. As I say, if we zoom right out into space, we could perceive the world from countless new directions and perspectives, freed from the constraints of the continents and the islands of our Earth, looking the way we expect them to on a map. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. And that's fine. I'd like to reassure you that your children generally don't have much of an idea what I'm talking about either. And that's, yeah, she's nodding her head. All right. I remember trying to explain this concept to a grade 7 student who just didn't quite get it. Thinking that I'd hit upon a surefire way to explain it to her, I asked her which way a rocket flies when it leaves America. Up, she replied. So I asked her which way a rocket flies when it leaves Australia. She thought for a second and said, down? Now, it doesn't bother me in the slightest that this student struggled with this exercise where I turned her world upside down. The conclusion, the answer in this case, wasn't the important part. The important part is that she was thinking. Critical thinking approaches allow us to identify and challenge implicit assumptions and dominant discourses. I alluded to this earlier, the ability to take taken for granted truths about the world and reframe narratives, like thinking about what it means to be from the West or the Middle East or the Far East. Now, this might seem a little too high concept for a middle school classroom, so I generally stick with the following phrase: thinking is an action. These are the words of author and educational theorist Bell Hooks, who always stylizes her name in lowercase like that, just in case any of you dare to think that this literacy teacher would ever make a typo. Bell Hooks spells out something that we all know at some level, but we're very liable to forget. The process of thinking is not merely some kind of involuntary knee-jerk over which we have no control. The act of thinking about subjects, of examining evidence, of exploring new perspectives is, like any physical exercise, valuable by its very nature, because the more we think, the better we get at thinking. Now, Green School is by its very nature a complex environment for critical thinking. This is a good way. Yeah, this is a good thing, by the way. We learn more from complexity than we do from simplicity. But we should take a second to think about what it is about Green School that makes it a complex environment, because, after all, thinking is an action. This school is one of a small number of schools around the world that can realistically frame itself as a destination school. Put simply, most of us who are not Indonesian came to Bali because of Green School. In most cases, we were sold on the school by a friend or an article in the media or the always outstanding work done by the marketing team. What this means in practice is that each of us arrives at Green School with a poorly rounded assumption of what the school is, an assumption which may or may not be reflected by reality. All families, and teachers for that matter, bring with them these taken for granted assumptions about the school and, crucially, about the wider world. A child's first culture is absolutely crucial, is a crucial anchor point for the development of their self. And so the vast majority of students, especially students who join us in middle school, already arrive at the school with a working model of how they think the world should be. These assumptions can be really difficult to unpick, especially if you're a 12-year-old who's been brought to the other side of the world by your parents. You're suddenly sharing a classroom with a chicken, and you need to hang on to some certainties from home. You're noticing a pattern in all of our talks. Yeah. Complexity also arises from the nature of the third culture bubble that we inhabit at Green School. This can manifest itself in innumerable different ways, of course, and I know that in my personal life, I'm often guilty of foregoing meaningful exchange with our host culture in exchange for the superficial pleasures of beach clubs and bars and all the luxuries that we are afforded as guests here in Bali. I think in middle school, though, among our students, this bubble mostly shows itself by our students subconsciously rationalizing their lived experiences, of thinking of their lives as normal. This is understandable, of course. Everybody wants to be normal to some extent because the implication is if you are not, you are somehow abnormal. But as I once said to one of my students, you are a 13-year-old Dutch boy. Your best friend is a 12-year-old Colombian boy. You live on the island of Bali in the nation of Indonesia. You speak to each other in English and you go surfing together every weekend. Your lived experience is, in the history of humanity, close to unique. So, therefore, is the way in which you see the world. You have a duty to think about that. Our Balinese students must somehow reconcile the cultural clash that on the one hand asks them to stay true to their own ancient culture, and on the other, be a fully integrated member of a highly progressive and highly international community. This is such an incredible ask of our students that I'm always amazed at how effectively our Balinese students accomplish it. I ask and require all of my students to critically reflect on how their own unique lived experience influences the person they are and the person they will become. This is challenging because their worldview is still a work in progress. But on the other hand, my worldview is still a work in progress, and so, I hope, is yours. I'm not sure I would ever trust anyone who acts like their worldview is not a work in progress. I think Green School is absolutely right to have think critically as a Green School skill, though I do believe it must be taught in a far more explicit manner. We must also carefully consider what critical thinking is and what it is not. Critical thinking is not the simple asking of questions. If this were true, then critical thinking will be a skill that we master sometime around the ages of 5 or 6 years old and slowly lose over time. The fact is, you'll often see people mask their inability to think critically by arguing that questioning and criticality go hand in hand. Think of the proverbial flat earth believer who will claim that his absurd beliefs are legitimate because he's simply asking questions. I think this definition that we have here is great, though I would suggest that we add one more strand. Accept evidence, form beliefs based on evidence, and if the evidence changes, our beliefs change. Our flat earth friend doesn't realize that continuing to ask questions past a reasonable point and refuse to accept overwhelming evidence doesn't make him a critical thinker, it makes him delusional. We all have a duty to accept overwhelming evidence and adjust our beliefs accordingly, especially when that evidence is gained through a scientific method. We are, after all, a community based upon combating the empirical reality of the science behind climate change. We have a duty to accept scientific evidence whenever it is generated. In our current global context, this is especially true in the incredible achievements of the science behind medical science. We accept this evidence, and we form our beliefs and act accordingly. If the evidence changes, our beliefs will change, but we make clear that it is peer-reviewed scientific evidence and not emotionally manipulative memes or amplified conspiracy theorists on social media that will cause a change in our beliefs. Thank you. I gave myself the rest of the afternoon off after I wrote that. I was quite happy. Yeah. Now, you probably already worked out that Guste wasn't being entirely honest when he said that I'm great at sticking to lesson plans. I don't think in my entire teaching career I found a lesson plan that I can't hopelessly sabotage within the first 5 minutes. And I'm okay with that. I was really honored recently when a mother of one of my grade 8s told me that her daughter says that she likes my class because I never underestimate their intelligence. And I do think that any literacy class is a wonderful opportunity to extend our knowledge of the world and discuss all manners of concepts and issues that I believe our young people should have a working knowledge of. This is true from geopolitics to anthropology, global religions, and moral dilemmas. Nicola already told you that literacy teachers like to think in analogies, and as usual, she's absolutely right. I Great boss. I like to think of the concepts that I explore with my students with an analogy of a glass fish tank in the center of a room. We don't merely glance at this concept from one direction and create a fixed, static opinion of what's inside. We explore the concept from countless angles. We see it from the front, from behind. We look over it, under it, round the sides. We might push our faces right up against the glass. We appreciate it in its entirety, and we zoom in on the individual constituent parts. We think about how those individual parts interact with and influence one another. If we're feeling brave, we might even plunge directly into the concept that we're exploring and leave it, what's my train of thought there? And leave it with a fresh, new perspective. We discuss how your perspective of a concept or an issue might be different to mine, and this is something to be valued. We understand that, although our views are valuable, there are also experts who can tell us far more about any given concept, as well as some people who might like to call themselves experts, but who are in fact anything but. It's only after considering all of these facts and opinions and perspectives that we draw our own conclusions. We're also not afraid of saying, after thinking deeply about any given concept, from all the different perspectives that I still just don't know the answer. We are, in fact, proud to say that we don't know. In a world where so many people claim to have answers, the act of saying, I don't know, after thinking as much as I can about something, is something to be admired. What matters is that we have achieved something profound by thinking about complex realities and using them to grow as lifelong learners and continue to think deeply about them in the future, because thinking is an action. Okay, let's move away from all that heavy stuff for a second and reward ourselves with another one of my favorite critical thinking exercises, one that I think illustrates firsthand just how knowledge is subject to change, but also just how far we have to go. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Now, you may be sat there thinking, no, he didn't, and you're absolutely right. We will get to that in a second. Our first thing to consider is that this sentence was taught uncritically for generations of school children, especially in the USA. I was practicing my speech just the other day with a grade 8 class, and 2 American grade 8s told me that when they were in elementary school back in the US, they were still taught this sentence. But we should take heart that every time I teach this thought exercise, there's always students who can say, no, he didn't pack Dave, because there were already indigenous people living in the Americas at the time. So, goodbye discovered. What else? Well, there's also the fact that these continents were not called America or the Americas until after Columbus's death. And there's also the fact that he never stepped foot in what is now called the USA. He initially landed in what is now the Bahamas and maintained bases of operation around numerous Caribbean islands, where he led campaigns of plundering and genocide so vicious that the indigenous peoples were virtually wiped out to be replaced by slaves from Africa, and forever altering the ethnic demographic of the Caribbean. So, goodbye America. 1492? Yeah. If you happen to be a Christian. I can assure you that the indigenous people of those Caribbean islands did not consider it to be the year 1492. Even today, despite the dominance of the Christian dating system, other religions and cultures maintain their own systems of dating, many considerably older than that was spread through the world by virtue of the predominance of Christianity. For the record, and I love looking up this kind of stuff, for the record, it's currently the year 5,781 in the ancient Hebrew calendar, which is the oldest continuous calendar I could find. So, goodbye 1492. And Christopher Columbus? Well, yeah, if you happen to be speaking English. But Christopher Columbus wasn't English. His expedition was sent by the Spanish crown. And in Spain, his name is Cristobal Colón. Except that Cristobal Colón wasn't Spanish. He was from Italy. And his birth name was Cristoforo Colombo. Except that he wasn't Italian, because the nation of Italy didn't come into existence until 1871. He was, in fact, from the city-state of Genoa, so he's genuine. Now, if this is confusing, good. What I hope to achieve from this thought exercise is to get across just how incredibly convoluted our knowledge of a given subject might be, even when it is taught as fact for hundreds of years. Who can know what truths of our society might be treated as falsehoods tomorrow? It's clear, though, that this man's complicated historical legacy goes far beyond merely not discovering America. Except that this isn't Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus never sat for a portrait in his life. Painting a portrait takes a lot of time, and he was presumably too busy murdering indigenous Caribbean people. This image, his most famous image, wasn't painted until 13 years after his death, from the recollections of some people who knew him. Imagine being asked to describe to a portrait painter the appearance of someone you have not seen since 2008, and we can get across that this is less an image of Christopher Columbus than a kind of identikit. And as a weird aside, if you go to the reception desk in Siloam Hospital on Sunset Road, there's a massive, this portrait, it's up behind the reception desk, and I have no idea why. Somebody find out for me, please. Now, big applause for Christopher Columbus there. Now, Columbus is an extreme example, perhaps, but I hope it drives home the following reality. Our knowledge of the world is transient, in flux, subject to change. So how does this all relate back to Green School? Well, I hope that one thing you've picked up from my presentation is my deep interest in the way that we process and apply knowledge and how our worldviews are formed. I try to bring this love of learning to all my classes, and I really do believe that students learn best when they have a teacher who doesn't just merely tell them the answer, but who clearly displays a deep love of the learning process and a commitment to their teaching discipline. My favorite description for the role of the teacher in the contemporary classroom is that of the authoritative ally, an individual who, yes, is in charge, as Professor Purcell was the time he came through a time portal from the past, an individual who, yes, is in charge and can effectively direct learning, but whose primary responsibility and goal is to facilitate the success of each individual learner, whatever that success might look like. I hope that I've lived up to that role during my 3 years at Green School Bali. So, what do I leave behind? I think it's difficult for teachers to reflect on their legacy. I think it's in our nature to step back and use whatever light we've been given in the hope that we help others burn brighter in the future. And it is especially painful to leave knowing that I have so much unfinished business at Green School, from the class focused explicitly on critical thinking skills that I'd hoped to develop in middle and high school, to the partnerships that I formed with organizations like Amnesty International, the Biosphere Foundation, Born Your Nature Foundation, and I'd hoped to continue to grow in the future. Most of all, I'm desperately sad that the incredible team of debaters that we have here at Green School have not yet reached their full potential. We travelled to Jakarta for a regional round of the World Scholars Cup in January 2020. Green School won just about every award going and qualified. Green School won just about every award going, qualified for the next round in Bangkok, and I am certain would have qualified for the Tournament of Champions at Yale University were it not for the pandemic. This is a team of young people who live out the skill of thinking critically and apply it confidently to their own lives. If you're a parent of one of my students, you probably already know that I love to use debate as a starting point for critical thinking and guided exploration of complex, real-world issues. If you've ever found yourself struggling to defeat your child in an argument because of their improved rhetorical skills, I'd like to think I played some part in that. But beyond a newfound ability to argue with their parents, I hope that I've left my students with something more, that I've grown in these young people, especially in the grades with whom I worked most closely, grades 9, 8, and 7. An understanding and appreciation of the intrinsic value of critical thinking, of reflecting upon their lived experience, how their worldview is constructed, who aren't afraid to ask questions and know what questions to ask. Students who understand that the more they think, the better they get at thinking, that thinking is an action. And what do I take away after 10 years in Indonesia? For me, it's the acknowledgement that one decade, or even one lifetime, is not possibly enough to gain a full understanding of a nation that stretches 5,000 kilometers from west to east, roughly the same distance as from England to Iran. A nation with 10% of the world's living languages, hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, cultures, and ways of understanding the world. One of only a handful of nations whose flora and fauna is officially listed as mega-diverse. The author, Elizabeth Pisani, describes Indonesia as the improbable nation. And for those of us who are guests in this land, I hope that we all take the time to reflect on our good fortune that we have been welcomed to spend some part of our lives in this magnificent country. With that in mind, I'd like to end on one final short critical thinking exercise. Right now, in Banda Aceh, on the northwest tip of Sumatra, there is an old Muslim woman. In Bali, in this sandkep right now, in fact, there is a teenage Hindu girl. And on the island of Kekachil, towards the southeast tip of this vast archipelago, there is a middle-aged man who practices Christianity fused with the animism of his ancestors. Now, these three people have virtually nothing in common with each other, except perhaps a couple of things. First, they share a language, maybe their second or third language, called Bahasa Indonesia, and therefore have a common frame of reference for understanding the world. But more than that, these three people share a sense of Indonesianness, whatever that might mean. I think our time in this improbable nation should be spent exploring that question. What is Indonesianness? With the full acknowledgement that we might never find an answer. I've been thinking about this question for the past 10 years, and I'm leaving Indonesia without getting any closer to an answer, but I've still had the best decade of my life. And this is a question that gets even more fascinating when we remember that old woman I told you about is older than the nation of Indonesia itself. That middle-aged man in Kekachil spent the first half of his life under a dictatorship and is now a member of one of the world's youngest and most vibrant democracies. And that teenage girl here with us in Bali is, like 135 million other Indonesians, around 50% of the population of this nation, under the age of 30 years old. Now that, I hope you'll agree, is something worth thinking about. And thinking is an action. Class dismissed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.